Was it?
All right, I'm ready for you, Dee.
Oh, all right. Well, you still want to wait a while for the tea?
Oh, we can. Yeah. No, don't worry. I just want to let you know that you.
Okay.
I'm ready.
You're ready when I am. Okay.
Fruit with the camera, please. So, and I can do tea stuff quietly.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess we could just get started and everybody can get their tea when they want. I'd like to talk to you today about Ferrin Fraser. Does anybody remember Ferrin Fraser? I only heard of him when I was first Gaines deputy historian. And after Mr. Latin there helped me get the position, the only one in the county, and then Howard Pratt resigned. Well, in the process of those couple years, this gentleman said, by the way, we need a history of Gaines because it's going to be 175 years. So this know-nothing had to go around and dig and see what I could find so I could do a book. And I did a book on the history of Gaines for the 175th. And in the process, I found out about Ferrin Fraser. Ferrin Fraser lived for a few years across from the Village Inn, across the Ridge Road on the other side, where Gould's live, and then beyond Gould's is a brick house. The brick house is where Ferrin Fraser lived, and the Gould's property was what he used for his workshop, where he wrote and became a nationally known radio scriptwriter. And in the 1930s, and he was working in our little village of Childs when he got a call from New York City from the Columbia Broadcasting Company telling him they wanted him to write the script for Little Orphan Annie on the radio. So it's like one of those things, my doing history, I find things that I go, wait a minute, that happened in Orleans County. That happened in Childs, where I lived, the little four corners with the biggest thing is the restaurant on the corner, as opposed to cobblestone, of course. But I mean, as far as history goes, the Village Inn is the longest lasting thing there at the corner. But here we have a scriptwriter for radio in the 1930s and 40s, and he's living in Childs, writing the script for Little Orphan Annie. So that got me wondering about Ferrin Fraser. He was born in 1903 in Lockport. His father and another man whose last name was Ferrin, and Ferrin Fraser's father, Mr. Fraser, Louis Fraser, ran a coal company in Lockport. It was the Ferrin and Fraser Coal Company. I have a feeling that's where Dad got his name for his son, Ferrin Fraser. Mr. Fraser was the secretary-treasurer of that coal company in Lockport, and Ferrin went to high school course in Lockport, went to Columbia University in the class of 1927, but he didn't graduate. And it doesn't say why he didn't, but his first successful work for radio was A Piece of String. That was the title of it. The drama premiered on New York's WABC at 9 p.m. on May 28, 1933. And his career was off and running. He did radio, movies, and television. He wrote radio script, of course, like I said, for Little Orphan Annie. And he also did scripts for Suspense, Lights Out, Nick Carter, and Master Detective. So he wrote for each one of those radio programs. And he was living here in Childs while he was doing it. He was the author of more than 500 short stories for magazines like Collier's Real Detective Tales, and Red Book. So he even wrote for nationally known magazines at the time. Ferrin and his wife Beatrice published books, one book of musical nonsense that teaches the names of various stringed instruments, because she was an organist for the Rochester Philharmonic. And he was an author, so they wrote a book about musical instruments. She was a graduate of the Eastman School of Music and an organist at the Eastman Theater and the Rochester Philharmonic. So they were both very well known in the 30s between Lockport and Rochester. Like I said, I did found out about about Ferrin Fraser and his wife when I was doing research for the Gaines book. And this is essentially what I put in there. During the 1930s and 40s, Childs was alive with various projects and ambitious people. In the early 1980s, televisions in the homes at Childs proclaimed two new entertainments: the revival of the play Little Orphan Annie and a new television series on Frank Buck's Bring 'Em Back Alive. Those two were popular again in the 1980s when I was pulling this book together. They both have ties to Childs in the 1930s and 40s. So, what is that, deja vu all over again? It was remarkable that here I'm doing the history and these things are popular again when I'm trying to write the book. They talked about, I talked about that being a revival in Gaines. Well, in the process of doing this book, I found out that Mrs. Fraser was still alive and well. And I found out that she was going to be in the area during this time that I was researching the book. So I found out how to contact her, and I interviewed her. So this is part of her interview. I taped the interview and felt very fortunate that she was still around and I could get her words. She remembers, "We passed this little red brick house here in Childs and it just entranced us. So we went back and the owner of the house was inside papering and we said, 'Is this for sale?' The answer was no, but Fraser rented it for $10 a month. It had no plumbing. There was a 4-holer, no electricity, just a shell. They began work on the house, and then one day, we didn't even have a telephone. A call came from Balcom's store from Ferrin's literary agent in New York. He said, 'There's a job waiting for you here.' It was continuing editor for Columbia Broadcasting. So we moved away, just shut up the house, and then, when we could, we'd come back and we started to improve it. When we came back from New York, Ferrin was doing Little Orphan Annie. He was doing the script here in Childs. He also wrote many books with Frank Buck, the Bring 'Em Back Alive man. Ferrin wrote over 500 short stories for leading magazines of the day, like Ladies' Home Journal and so on. We bought the house next door and made it into a studio. That's where Bags lived. But the heating problem was so bad, he took an office in the bank building. So it was too cold to work in that house, so he went down to the bank and got a place to work over top of the bank. Mr. Fraser wrote the scripts, like I said, for Little Orphan Annie, Lights Out, Terror, Suspense, and Nick Carter. The Frasers combined their efforts and wrote 4 children's books, all with a music theme, which were published by such famous publishing houses as Bobbs Merrill and Little Brown and Company. Mrs. Fraser is well known in her own field of endeavor music as an accomplished organist. While she attended college in Rochester, she submitted for an organist at the Eastman Theater one Christmas. Mr. Eastman was in the audience that night, and at the end of the performance, she remembers he stood and said, "Why don't we hear more from that girl?" So Mr. Eastman gave his seal of approval to her. The Eastman did hire her, and she did solos 4 times a day all the time she was in college. She saved her money and went to Paris to study music, and her high school beau followed her there, Ferrin. They were married there and returned to Rochester. So they were married in Paris when they were both there. At the beginning of the Second World War, they moved to Lockport, and Mr. Fraser worked in communications with the war effort. Mrs. Fraser was an organist and choir director for 25 years for the First Presbyterian Church in Lockport and gained notoriety for her development of the handbell choirs. Mr. Fraser died in 1969 in Lockport, and Mrs. Fraser moved to Florida. So it was her coming back up here to visit when I just happened to call at the right time and got an interview with her, which I felt very fortunate about.
Where was it you did the interview?
In Childs. I met her. I met her at the Village Inn at one point, and then we went over to Cobblestone too, and interviewed her. And
when did she pass away? You know?
Yeah.
Did she live much after that? Well, that's okay.
No, that's all right. I've got it. I just gotta find it. Yeah, she died the 29th of June, 1992.
Wow.
And I interviewed her in the 80s. So she lived like 10 years after I interviewed her.
Long life.
Long life, yep. And because he had died earlier. He died in 1969. Okay, so it was a long time that he passed, and she still was around. But she had her own notoriety too. She was did the choirs and the bell choirs, and she was very famously well known. There were articles like in 1938 in the Medina Tribune. Ridge Road Boy made famous Orphan Annie, which I thought was kind of a funny title because he wasn't really a boy, he was a man when he wrote Little Orphan Annie. But I guess they got carried away with Little Orphan. His name is Ferrin Fraser. He lives in a delightful small white brick house, formerly a crumbling ruin, tenanted by a goat on the Ridge Road. So I think it needed some rehab when they got that. 3 miles north of the village of Albion. Mr. Fraser is married, but childless. His wife was the former B. Ryan, once a student in the Eastman School of Music and later an organist at the Eastman Theater. She is a pretty, lively, gracious young woman who may or may not help her husband in the arrangement of his studio scripts. So maybe she helps and maybe she doesn't. Mr. Fraser bought an old house next door, filled it up as a studio and a hall for his living quarters. But that's when he found out it was just not comfortable enough, too cold, didn't have enough electricity, and he moved down and up over the bank. It says, a year ago last winter, he did the inevitable hitch at Hollywood screenwriting that nowadays appears to be part of the rounded education of established authors. Last winter, he worked in Bermuda for 2 months, but Bermuda was hardly a suitable place to do American radio material that had to meet deadlines. A dock strike tied up the mail boats for a time while the Orphan Annie scripts piled up on Mr. Fraser's writing table. There was a hitch in the airmail service, and when he did send his offerings, one each day, back to the States by this service, the postage was $8 each. Pretty soon, the radio people got tired of delayed copy and ordered Mr. Fraser back to the native land. So he returned to his delightful home on the Ridge Road, and there, presumably, he will remain until snow flies. Next winter, the Frasers plan to build in Miami and divide their time between that resort and the renovated farmhouse north of Albion. And that was in May 12th of 1938, the Medina Journal. Medina Tribune, excuse me. Yes, Medina Tribune. The Medina Tribune in 1938 says, Ferrin Fraser's play has screen stars and cast. An adaptation of the original story In Love and How by Ferrin Fraser, well-known Albion novelist who has many Medina friends, was produced in Woodbury's Hollywood Playhouse radio program. Sunday evening, Tyrone Power, Pat Patterson, and Mary Astor were three of the actors appearing in the cast. So he was well known, but there were well-known people who wanted to act on his behalf in his plays or his writings, which I found very amazing. I mean, how many people know Mary Astor and Tyrone Power? I mean, you know, and they were ones that wanted to act in his play. During World War II, Ferrin Fraser worked here locally and led scrap drives for metal in World War II. He had a column in the Lindenville Enterprise called Facts Are Fun, and stated that the New York governor gets the highest pay. Well, he's just telling the facts, you know. November 1942, Ferrin, the director of Department of Publicity and Information for the Orleans War Council, explained the war effort to citizens through his newspaper column. He gave a speech, War Propaganda as it Affects Each Individual. The Speakers Bureau chairman that year was Beatrice Fraser, with Joan Waggoner and Howard Woods. So she was involved too in the war effort as well as Ferrin was. In 1950, an article about his collaboration with Frank Buck was noted. Fraser was a resident of Rochester and was a wartime editor of the Harrison Chronicle, published by the Harrison Radiator Division of General Motors. He really got around.
Yes, he did.
In 1959, Beatrice was organist and director of music at the First Baptist Church in Rochester. She arranged music and directed both choirs, also a writer of children's books with Ferrin, Bernie the Bear Who Grew Too Fast, and A Song Is Born. So those two, Bernie the Bear That Grew Too Fast, tells about different instruments. Bernie was growing, and as he grew, he played a different instrument each time, and then the instruments were explained. The 35th class reunion of Eastman School of Music in 1962, Beatrice Ryan Fraser, Director of Music in Lockport, the First Presbyterian Church. One of her duties is to direct the Girls' Handbell Choir, which is making appearances at several churches in Lockport area. In addition, she is a composer and author of children's books. Also in 1927, Beatrice Fraser is founder and director of the School of Magic Music, Lockport, New York, the first in a series of pre-piano books for children. Benny the Bear Who Grew Too Fast was published recently by Mrs. Fraser and her husband. Mrs. Fraser conceived the idea for the series while looking at material for her classes. So she was teaching music classes and came up with this idea of Bernie going through different instruments and explaining to children what they were and what they did. Ferrin Fraser, who wrote, among other things, the Frank Buck books. Frank Buck was an adventurer who went to Africa and saw wildlife that you would never see in the United States. He ended up not shooting and killing, but bringing those rare animals and birds back to the United States alive so that the American people could see these animals and birds. And he was a friend of Ferrin Fraser. And he and Ferrin Fraser authored 5 books together. Frank Buck, in his reminiscence, I think I've got a list here, that tells the kinds of animals that he collected. He ended up bringing to the United States 100,000 animals from Africa. And I had to read that 3 times before it sunk in. You know, it wasn't 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 animals. Birds, elephants, crocodiles, you name it. Animals out of Africa, he brought back here. And he was a friend of Ferrin Fraser. And he and Ferrin combined their efforts on 5 books. Let's see here. In the 1930s and 40s, Ferrin Fraser turned to radio script writing. Like I said, Lights Out, Suspense, Little Orphan Annie. He later adapted some of those radio scripts for TV in the 1950s. But the bulk of his writing came as a collaborator with hunter and animal trainer Frank Buck. Together, the two wrote 5 books, including Buck's autobiography, All in a Lifetime, in 1941. The books that they co-authored one was called Fang and Claw in 1935, Tim Thompson in the Jungle in 1935, On Jungle Trails in 1936, All in a Lifetime in 1941, and Jungle Animals in 1945. Buck claims his first Asian animal collecting trip was in late 1912, early 1913. He states that from this shipment he sold tigers and birds, leopards and pythons, and the remaining birds to Robinson Bird Store and other dealers for a net profit of $6,000, and 3 weeks later went back to Singapore. He also states that after the close of the San Francisco World's Fair, he went to work as Director of Publicity and Promotion for Mark Sennett's studio for 7 months, but it was the sunrises over the Malayan jungle that I missed. I headed back for Singapore, headed for everything the jungle and life could do for me. According to Buck, he was then involved in animal collecting for the next 16 years. So Frank Buck, and he was a close friend of Ferrin Fraser. Frank Buck was born in 1884 in Gainesville. He enjoyed collecting birds and other small animals throughout childhood. His most promising subject was geography. The curriculum bored him, but he eventually made his way to Chicago. And, they just didn't do what he was interested in. In 1911, he took an extended trip to Brazil and explored deep into the rainforest. Fascinated by the beauty and extensive wildlife he saw, Buck brought back dozens of exotic birds to the United States. As he disembarked in New York, he found many people just as fascinated with birds, who then convinced Buck to sell them at a comfortable profit. Inspired, Buck then went to Asia to bring back more exotic animals to sell in the United States, and began a life as an animal trapper. So he trapped and brought back the animals, but he didn't kill them. He wasn't hunting the animals, he was bringing them back. For the next several years, he trapped and collected thousands of animals for zoos and private collectors. Over the course of his career, he captured snakes, birds, elephants, tigers, lions, kangaroos, camels, giraffes, crocodiles, and hyenas. Buck estimated that his expeditions took as many as 100,000 animals altogether. Went over, captured them, and brought them back alive for Americans to see. To me, I just can't comprehend it. It's just, and he did this over 16 years.
And the method of travel was
Yeah.
just a plain old boat.
Right.
Nothing like an airplane.
And then to get them from the boat
yes.
to a zoo would have to be a train. You think about the transportation back then, and you're transporting everything from snakes to elephants. It just...
It's kind of expensive.
Well, yeah, but, you think about it, we look at it today as nearly impossible. They looked at it as, we've got these huge boats. We've got this railroad that travels from here to here. It doesn't have to stop for any stop signs. It doesn't have to worry about the police. You just put your animals on there and you take off. So, it was the modern way of travel. But we look at it today and think, oh my God, what a lot of work. What a lot of time. How do you make contacts for the zoos that will take them? I mean, you think about all the planning that had to be done after you've captured the animal in a foreign country and transported it. I mean, when you stop and think of the details.
You can't
Of
just
these
call
two men.
somebody on their cell phone.
Yeah, right, you can't say, meet us at the station. You know?
International telegrams
Yeah.
and
Right, you think about all the complications.
And to, food to feed the animals.
Yeah, to feed
Maybe
the
there
animals.
weren't there complications back then.
But you think, like she said, feeding the animals, you've got to have
Oh,
food
yeah.
to keep them alive. So you have to know what they eat. And you've got snakes and you've got elephants.
the more we're talking about this, the harder, the more
The more
impossible it
complicated.
seems.
Yeah,
Well, just think what Noah went through.
I know.
and trying to get them all on one boat.
Wouldn't happen today because of the endangered species laws.
Yeah, well, there'd be a lot more protective laws for the animals than there were back then. I mean, that was just, everybody praised him because he didn't kill them. He brought them back alive for us to actually see how that animal lives. And there were animals that we just didn't have in the United States. You know, they were all ones from tropical areas, Africa, you know, where, and people didn't always travel. Now we think, well, you could go over there and see them on, well, yeah, but back then, no. You had to find a way to get there, but you had to have the money to get the tickets to get there too. You know, and have the money to stay there and then have the money to come back with. When you think about those days, it was probably easier to bring the animals to us so that more people could see them. In March 1950, Ferrin Fraser died in Houston following a protracted fight with lung cancer. So that's why he died before she, by quite a few years. But I think it's phenomenal that we have people like this living in Orleans County, and a lot of these we didn't know about, or you know, people knew about them and oh yeah, well that was in the 30s, that was too recent. You know, it wasn't really history, you know, like 1850. You know, no, this was 1930s. And for me to be able to speak to his wife in the 1980s was, oh my God, she's still alive. Wow, I could get her quotes. That's what history's all about, is learning it from firsthand knowledge. Really tells you, because once the stories get told, things get altered, and once you hear the story again after it's been through 50 people, it isn't exactly the way you told it first. But it was kind of nice to hear it from the mouth of somebody who lived it. So, well, thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So.